Before sunrise, the entire building was gone. Nothing left but burned beams, drifting smoke, and a road covered in ash. But what investigators discovered in those ashes made the story far more disturbing. Footprints, clear, fresh, and leading away from the ruins, not toward them, which meant something walked out of that fire before the roof collapsed. But to understand how that happened, we have to go back a few hours, to a night that started with music. A crowded hall in a forgotten Louisiana town, lanterns glowing, boots stomping, blues echoing through the rafters of an old sawmill that hadn't seen life in years. For the people of Redwood Hollow, it was supposed to be a celebration, a new beginning. But sometime after midnight, a man stepped outside for air and never came back. 20 minutes later, they found him on the road, cold, still, 2 strange marks on his neck, and the forest around him had gone completely silent because something had come out of the trees that night. And by the time the music stopped, the celebration had turned into a nightmare no one in Redwood Hollow would ever forget. By sunrise, the building would be nothing but charred beams and drifting smoke. The music would be gone, the crowd would be gone, and the few people who survived that night would spend years trying to explain what happened inside. But just a few hours earlier, the place was alive, and the night still felt full of promise. Northern Louisiana, spring 1933. A small logging town called Redwood Hollow sat between swamps and pine forest. It wasn't the kind of place people moved to. It was the kind of place people ended up. A railroad stop, a sawmill, a handful of stores along one dusty road. Most nights were quiet. By 10 o'clock, the town usually fell into silence. But that evening, something unusual was happening at the far edge of town. For the first time in years, the old mill building near the river had lights inside again. The structure had been empty for nearly a decade. Once, it was the heart of the town. Huge circular saws, stacks of timber, workers moving day and night. Then, the mill closed. The machines were taken away. The workers left. And slowly, the building became something else. A place people avoided after dark. No one talked about it directly, but locals had a habit of lowering their voices when the mill came up in conversation. One of the older residents had even said something strange during the renovations. That building's been quiet too long. At the time, most people laughed it off. Later, some would remember that warning differently. The men responsible for reopening the place were newcomers, 2 brothers who had arrived only weeks earlier, Caleb Ward and Jonah Ward. They claimed to have spent years working in river towns further north. No one knew much about them before that. What people did notice was the money. Fresh lumber, new lamps, a piano hauled in on a wagon. Within days, the abandoned mill was transformed into something unexpected. A music hall, a place for dancing, whiskey, and live blues. In a town where entertainment usually meant sitting on a porch and listening to crickets, that idea spread quickly. By sunset on opening night, wagons and cars were already lining the road. For a few hours, Redwood Hollow felt different, lighter, almost hopeful. Inside, the air smelled of oil lamps and fresh-cut pine. Lanterns hung from the rafters where saw chains once rattled. The wooden floor had been sanded smooth for dancing, and in the far corner stood a small stage. That stage belonged to a young musician named Daniel Carter, guitar resting against his knee. Voice calm but powerful. For him, the night meant something more than just a performance. His father was the town's preacher, and in that household, blues music wasn't celebration, it was temptation. At the time, Daniel didn't seem to care. The room was full. The crowd was smiling, and the music was about to begin. Just before midnight, a small moment passed almost unnoticed. Outside the building, near the tree line, a stray dog began barking. The animal stood stiff, staring into the dark forest beyond the road. It barked again and again, as if something out there had caught its attention. Inside the hall, no one noticed. The music had started. Boots tapped against the wooden floor. Laughter echoed under the rafters. Years later, one survivor would remember the dog clearly, because animals often sense things long before people do. Around that same time, a stranger appeared at the entrance, tall, thin, wearing a dark coat despite the warm southern air. No one saw him arrive. One moment, the doorway was empty. The next moment, he was standing there, quietly watching the room. Someone offered him a drink. He declined. Another man asked where he was from. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside and leaned against one of the support beams, eyes moving slowly across the crowd. Later, witnesses would recall something unusual. Through the entire night, no one ever saw the man touch a glass. A few minutes after midnight, one of the guests stepped outside, maybe for air, maybe for a cigarette. Inside, the band kept playing. The crowd kept dancing. But the man who walked into the darkness never returned. And at that moment, no one inside the music hall realized the night had already begun to change. At first, no one noticed the silence. One man had stepped outside and simply hadn't come back. Inside the music hall, the band kept playing. But outside, beyond the lantern light, something had already begun moving through the dark. For the first hour, the celebration continued almost exactly as planned. Boots pounded against the wooden floor. Laughter rolled across the room. The smell of whiskey and sweat mixed with the sharp scent of fresh lumber. On the small stage, Daniel Carter leaned into the microphone and sang with a voice that seemed older than he was. His guitar cut through the noise. People clapped. Couples spun across the floor. For a moment, Redwood Hollow felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. But slowly, something subtle began to change. The first person to notice was the bartender, a broad man named Ellis Harper. He wiped a glass and looked toward the entrance. One of the regulars had stepped outside earlier, a logger named Tom Grady. Tom was loud, always laughing, not the kind of man who disappeared quietly. Ellis glanced toward the door again, still no sign of him. At first, it didn't seem important. People stepped outside all the time. Fresh air, a cigarette. But 10 minutes passed, then 15, and Tom still hadn't returned. Across the room, Caleb Ward noticed the same thing. He leaned toward his brother Jonah. Tom stepped out a while ago. Jonah shrugged. Maybe he found better company outside. It drew a laugh, but Caleb's eyes drifted toward the doorway. Something about the empty entrance bothered him. Later, he would struggle to explain why. Just a feeling, the kind that appears before a storm. Around that same time, someone else saw something strange. A young waitress carrying drinks to the back tables. As she passed the wall where the stranger stood, she glanced at him, the tall man in the dark coat. For a moment, their eyes met, and she noticed something unsettling. His skin looked almost gray under the lantern light. Not pale from illness, pale like something that hadn't seen sunlight in a very long time. At the time, she told herself it was just the lighting. Years later, she would remember that detail very clearly. 20 minutes after Tom had left the building, two men finally stepped outside to look for him. Ellis, the bartender, and another logger named Frank Dalton. They pushed the door open and stepped into the night. The noise of the music faded behind them. Outside, The air felt colder. The road stretched empty toward the forest. For a moment, neither man said anything. Then Ellis called out, "Tom?" No answer, only the slow movement of wind through the pines. Frank walked a few steps toward the tree line. Lantern light from the building barely reached that far. Shadows moved across the ground. Then Frank stopped. "Ellis, come here." His voice had changed, quieter, tighter. Ellis stepped closer, and then he saw it. Tom Grady was lying in the dirt beside the road, face turned toward the trees, not moving. They rolled him onto his back. Tom's skin felt cold, too cold. His face had gone pale, almost colorless. But it wasn't the stillness that frightened them. It was the wound. 2 small punctures just below his jaw. At first glance, it looked almost insignificant, barely bleeding. But something about it was wrong. Frank leaned closer and suddenly took a step back. "Ellis, look at his neck." Ellis did, and felt the first real flicker of fear that night, because the wound didn't look like teeth from any animal he had ever seen. Inside the music hall, the band kept playing. Daniel's voice rose through another verse. The crowd clapped in rhythm. No one knew what had been discovered outside. But near the back wall, the stranger in the dark coat had turned his head slightly, as if he had heard something others could not. And for the first time that evening, he smiled. Outside, Ellis and Frank looked down at Tom's body. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Frank whispered something neither of them truly believed. Probably an animal. But even as he said it, both men knew something didn't make sense, because the forest around them had gone completely silent. And from somewhere beyond the trees, something moved, slowly, watching them. And suddenly, Ellis realized something else. Tom hadn't been dragged into the woods. He had fallen exactly where he stood, which meant whatever attacked him had been standing right there on the road. For a few seconds, Ellis and Frank simply stood there. The night around them had gone completely still. Behind them, music and laughter spilled from the mill building. Inside, the party was still going. But outside, something had already changed. And the 2 men standing over Tom Grady were about to understand that the night was no longer normal. Ellis knelt beside the body again. Up close, Tom didn't look injured the way a man usually did after an attack. There was no torn clothing, no deep wounds, just that small mark near his neck. 2 punctures, precise, clean, too clean. Ellis touched the skin near the wound. It felt cold, not the coolness of night air. Something deeper, the kind of cold that shouldn't be there yet. Tom had only been gone 20 minutes. "Help me lift him," Ellis said quietly. Frank hesitated. Something about the body made him uneasy, but he grabbed Tom's shoulders anyway. Together they pulled him upright. Tom's head rolled slightly to the side, and for a brief second, Ellis thought he saw Tom's lips move. But when he leaned closer, nothing happened. Just the quiet rustling of wind through the trees. Frank scanned the darkness beyond the road. The forest stood only 30 yards away, a wall of black pines. Something about it felt different now, like the trees themselves were watching. "Did you hear that?" Frank asked. Ellis froze. At first he heard nothing. Then, a faint sound. Not footsteps. Not an animal. More like something sliding slowly across the ground. Somewhere in the dark between the trees. Both men turned toward the forest. The lantern light from the building didn't reach that far. Beyond the edge of the road, the world became shadow. And for a moment, Ellis thought he saw something move between the trunks. A shape. Tall. Too tall to be a deer. But when he blinked, the movement was gone. Years later, Ellis would insist on one detail investigators struggled to explain. He said the forest didn't feel empty that night. It felt crowded, as if several things were standing just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. At the time, Frank thought Ellis was imagining things. "Let's get him inside," he said. The music from the hall suddenly felt very far away. They lifted Tom and began carrying him toward the entrance. The moment they stepped into the lantern light, the sounds of the party returned. Boots stomping, glasses clinking, Daniel Carter's guitar ringing through the hall. Inside, people were still dancing, still laughing, still unaware. Ellis kicked the door open with his foot. The band didn't stop, but the people closest to the entrance turned when they saw the two men carrying Tom. Conversation faltered. The music slowed, and within seconds, the energy in the room shifted. Caleb Ward pushed through the crowd. "What happened?" Ellis laid Tom down on the floorboards, found him outside. Jonah knelt beside the body. The lantern light revealed Tom's pale face. Someone in the crowd gasped. Daniel's guitar faded into silence. For the first time that night, the room was quiet. Jonah leaned closer to the wound. His expression changed. "What did this?" Ellis shook his head. Frank spoke before he could stop himself. "Looked like teeth." A murmur rippled through the room. Someone laughed nervously. "Probably a wolf." But another voice spoke from the back. Quiet, calm. "Wolves don't bite like that." Heads turned. The stranger in the dark coat had stepped forward. For the first time that night, he moved closer to the crowd. His eyes rested on Tom's neck, then slowly lifted to the faces around him. Something about his calmness made several people uncomfortable. Before anyone could respond, Tom's body suddenly jerked. Just once, a sharp movement, like someone pulling invisible strings. A woman near the bar screamed. Tom's chest rose, then fell again. For a moment, hope flickered across the room. Maybe he wasn't dead. Maybe he was waking up. But Ellis noticed something else. Tom's eyes were still closed, and the cold in his skin had not changed. Across the room, the stranger's faint smile returned. Outside, the wind shifted. The lantern hanging above the entrance swayed gently. And beyond the open door, something moved again near the tree line. Only this time, it wasn't just one shape. Several darker silhouettes shifted between the trunks. Too far away to see clearly, but close enough to know they were there, watching the building, watching the light. Inside the hall, people crowded around Tom's body. Whispers spread quickly. Animal attack. Poison. Some kind of sickness. No one wanted to say the other possibility out loud. But at the doorway, Ellis looked past the lantern light toward the forest. And for the first time that night, he realized something terrifying. Tom hadn't been the only thing out there. Because now, in the darkness between the trees, several pairs of faint, unmoving eyes were staring back at the building. For a moment, everyone in the music hall believed Tom Grady was waking up. His chest moved, his fingers twitched. Hope flickered across the room. But the thing that opened its eyes was not the man who had walked outside earlier that night. Tom's eyes snapped open, not slowly, not like someone regaining consciousness, instantly. The movement was so sudden that several people jumped back. His pupils were wide, too wide, almost swallowing the color of his eyes entirely. For a few seconds, he didn't move. He simply stared upward at the ceiling beams. Then his head turned, slowly, toward the crowd standing around him, and the expression on his face was completely empty. Not pain, not confusion, just hunger. "Tom?" someone whispered. No response. Jonah leaned closer, reaching out carefully. Easy. Take it slow. The moment his hand touched Tom's shoulder, Tom moved, fast. Too fast for a man who had supposedly been unconscious seconds earlier. He lunged upward. The sudden motion knocked Jonah backward into a table. Glasses shattered across the floor. A woman screamed. The room exploded into movement. Tom stood now, but something about the way he moved felt wrong. His posture was stiff, jerky, like his body was still learning how to stand again. Caleb grabbed Jonah and pulled him away. What the hell is wrong with him? Tom didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, listening, not to the people, but to something else, something outside. Near the entrance, Ellis noticed the stranger again. The tall man in the dark coat hadn't moved during the chaos. He simply watched, eyes fixed on Tom, almost approving. Ellis felt a chill run down his spine because the stranger didn't look surprised. He looked like he had been expecting this. Tom suddenly turned toward the nearest person, a young man who had been standing near the bar. Before anyone could react, Tom rushed forward. The speed shocked everyone in the room. Chairs toppled. People stumbled backward. Caleb grabbed a heavy wooden stool and swung it. The stool slammed into Tom's chest, knocking him sideways. Tom hit the floor hard, but he didn't stay down. Within seconds, he was moving again, climbing back to his feet with unnatural quickness. Now the entire hall was in chaos. People rushed toward the doors. Others climbed onto tables trying to get away. Someone shouted for a doctor. Someone else shouted to lock the entrance. Daniel Carter stood frozen near the stage, guitar still hanging from his shoulder. The music had stopped, but the echo of it seemed to linger in the rafters, like the building itself hadn't realized the celebration was over. Then someone screamed from the window. "Outside!" Heads turned. Through the glass panes, shapes were moving in the darkness beyond the lantern light. At first it looked like shadows from the trees, but then one stepped forward. A tall figure, pale, standing just beyond the edge of the road. Then another appeared, and another, slowly, silently, watching the building, watching the light. Inside, Tom suddenly stopped moving. His head lifted, as if he had sensed them. For the first time since standing up, he looked toward the door, toward the figures outside. And then something even more disturbing happened. He smiled, not like a man greeting friends, more like something recognizing its own kind. Caleb followed Tom's gaze, then looked through the window, and finally understood. Tom wasn't the only one. Whatever had attacked him in the forest had come back. And now it wasn't hiding anymore. Outside, the figures slowly moved closer to the building. The lantern above the entrance flickered as the wind shifted. Inside the hall, dozens of terrified people were trapped between the walls. Behind them, Tom. In front of them, the darkness outside. And as the first pale hand touched the door handle, Caleb realized something terrifying. The music hall wasn't just a party anymore. It had become a feeding ground. The door burst open. Cold night air rushed into the hall. And with it, the shadows from the forest. For hours, the music hall had been a place of laughter. Now it had become something else entirely. A trap. The first figure moved faster than anyone expected. It slipped through the doorway like a gust of wind, crossing the floor before people fully understood what was happening. Someone screamed. Chairs toppled. The crowd surged backward toward the stage. Another shape appeared at the window, then another at the entrance. The lantern above the door flickered wildly as the wind shifted. For a moment, the room filled with confusion. No one knew where to run, or what exactly they were running from. Caleb Ward grabbed a table and shoved it toward the door. "Back!" The heavy wood crashed against the frame, but the figures outside didn't retreat. They simply watched, pale faces hovering just beyond the lantern light. Inside, Tom Grady moved again. His head turned slowly toward the entrance, toward the shapes waiting outside. And once more, that empty smile returned, as if the chaos around him meant nothing, as if he belonged to the darkness beyond the door. People rushed toward the back exit. Ellis forced the door open. Cold air flooded the room. "Move! Everyone move!" The crowd pushed toward the opening. Some stumbled. Others helped pull the injured along. Through it all, the old record player near the stage suddenly came alive. The needle dropped against the spinning disc. A slow blues melody crackled through the hall. Soft, almost fragile, but steady. For a strange moment, the music continued while the room fell apart around it. Boots scraping wood, glass shattering, voices shouting over one another. Yet the song kept playing. Daniel Carter stood frozen beside the stage. The same melody he had played earlier that night now echoed through the burning hall. Only now it sounded different, slower, heavier. Like the building itself was remembering the celebration that had existed only hours before. Caleb looked around the room. Broken tables, spilled lamp oil, dry wooden walls. And suddenly, he understood. One of the lanterns had fallen during the struggle. Flame touched the floorboards. At first, it was just a small flicker. Then the fire began to spread. Oil caught. Dry timber answered instantly. Thin lines of orange light raced across the floor. The walls began to glow. Smoke curled toward the rafters. Caleb turned toward the crowd. "Everyone out!" The rush for the exits became desperate. Ellis dragged 2 injured men through the back door. Daniel helped a young woman climb through the window. The music still played behind them, the record spinning slowly, the melody repeating again and again. Inside the hall, the fire climbed the walls. Smoke thickened. The figures near the doorway hesitated as the flames grew brighter. For the first time that night, the darkness seemed to retreat. Through the rising smoke, Caleb saw the tall stranger again, standing calmly near the far wall, watching the fire spread. Their eyes met through the haze. For a moment, neither man moved. Then the stranger spoke quietly. "You brought the light." The words sounded almost like approval. Not anger, not fear, just recognition. Then he stepped backward, into the deeper shadow of the hallway, and disappeared. The fire roared now. Wood beams cracked under the heat. Caleb turned toward the door, but before he could reach it, part of the ceiling collapsed behind him. A rain of sparks filled the air. Outside, the survivors staggered away from the building. Ellis turned back just in time to see Caleb's silhouette through the flames. A dark figure moving between walls of fire. For a moment, it looked like he was heading toward the exit. Then, the smoke swallowed everything. The roof gave a long, groaning crack, and the music inside the hall finally stopped. Hours later, the fire burned itself out. Morning fog drifted across the road. Where the music hall once stood, only blackened beams remained. Smoke curled slowly into the pale sky. The forest stood silent again, as if nothing unusual had happened there at all. Daniel Carter sat near the edge of the road, his guitar resting across his knees. After a long silence, he began to play. The same melody from earlier that night. Quiet, almost careful. The camera would pull back slowly. Burned wood, ash drifting through the morning mist, sunlight rising over the pine trees, Redwood Hollow waking to a new day. Ellis walked carefully through the ruins. Something caught his eye near the edge of the burned floor. Footprints. Faint marks pressed into the ash. Not leading into the building. Leading away from it. Toward the forest. Ellis followed them with his eyes until they disappeared among the trees. For a moment, the woods looked completely empty. Then, somewhere deep in the shadows, something shifted. By morning, the music hall was gone. Most people in Redwood Hollow never spoke about that night again. But some still believe that when the wind moves through those trees, the forest is remembering, and that whatever came out of the dark that night may not be finished yet.